You know about the Civil War. You know about World War II. But in the late 1800s, a secret war was fought, and it happened in the hills of West Virginia. This war was between coal miners and the coal companies who employed them. For decades, working in the coal mines meant you had low pay, dangerous tools, and you were always unsafe. If you wanted to form a union to fight for better conditions, you couldn't. The coal companies had contracts that said if you joined a union, you were fired instantly and kicked out of your home if you lived in a company town. Before we continue, take 2 seconds to subscribe to Hustle Historian, like this video, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. By 1920, thousands of miners finally joined the United Mine Workers Union. The companies responded immediately. They fired everyone and sent private security guards, hired detectives to throw the families out of their homes. In the town of Matewan that May, a dozen detectives arrived to start the evictions. They even tried to bribe the mayor to set up machine guns on the roofs, which he refused. Instead of just evicting families, the detectives forced them out at gunpoint. The town's police chief, Sid Hatfield, confronted the group and tried to arrest them. A gunfight erupted, and when the smoke cleared, 10 men were dead, including the mayor. This Matewan massacre enraged the miners. For months afterward, the two sides were in a shooting war, with ambushes and assassinations everywhere. The anger exploded in August 1921, when the beloved Chief Sid Hatfield was killed walking into a courthouse. The miners had enough. 10,000 pro-union activists grabbed their guns and decided to march on the coal companies. An anti-union sheriff found out the miners were coming. He quickly gathered a private army of 3,000 police and set up fortified trenches around a place called Blair Mountain. On August 28, 10,000 armed Union men met the resistance. What followed was the largest armed revolt in the United States since the Civil War. It took a week, and President Warren G. Harding had to send in federal troops and bombers to stop the fighting. But to truly understand how America reached this point, where its own citizens were bombing each other over the right to organize, you need to go back to where it all began. Deep in the coal camps of Appalachia, where men descended into darkness every morning, not knowing if they'd see sunlight again. The coal industry in West Virginia wasn't just an industry, it was a kingdom, and the coal operators were its kings. These weren't your typical businessmen worried about quarterly profits and shareholder meetings. These were men who controlled entire counties, who owned the land, the houses, the stores, even the currency. When a miner came to work for one of these companies, he wasn't just taking a job, he was entering a system designed to keep him trapped forever. The company owned everything, and they made sure you knew it. Miners lived in company houses, flimsy wooden structures that leaked in the rain and froze in the winter, structures they could be evicted from at a moment's notice. They shopped at company stores where prices were inflated to astronomical levels, and they were paid not in real American dollars, but in scrip company money that was only good at that same company store. It was a closed loop of exploitation, a system so perfectly designed to extract wealth from the workers that many miners found themselves in debt despite working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Imagine waking up before dawn, walking through the cold mountain air to a mine entrance that looks like a mouth leading straight to hell, and then descending hundreds of feet into the earth, where the air is thick with coal dust, where the only light comes from the small lamp on your helmet, where every crack and groan of the mountain above you is a reminder that thousands of tons of rock could come crashing down at any second. That was the daily reality for West Virginia coal miners. They worked in tunnels so narrow they had to crawl on their hands and knees, swinging their pickaxes in spaces barely wide enough to move. The dust they breathed would settle in their lungs, causing a disease called black lung that would slowly suffocate them over the years. Explosions were common. Methane gas would build up in pockets, and a single spark could turn an entire section of the mine into an inferno. Cave-ins buried men alive, crushing them under tons of rock or trapping them in pockets of darkness where they'd slowly run out of air. And when these disasters happened, the companies rarely took responsibility. There were no workers' compensation laws, no safety regulations worth mentioning, no accountability. A man died, and another man took his place the next day. The companies made sure to keep the miners divided and powerless. They employed a sophisticated system of control that went far beyond just economic exploitation. They hired private detective agencies, the most infamous being the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, to serve as their enforcers. These weren't your typical rent-a-cops. These were hardened men, many of them former criminals themselves, who had no qualms about using violence and intimidation to keep the miners in line. They served as spies, infiltrating any group that seemed to be organizing, reporting back to the companies about who was talking union. They'd plant evidence on troublemakers and have them arrested on trumped-up charges. They'd follow men home and make veiled threats about what might happen to their families if they didn't keep their mouths shut. And when the situation called for it, they'd use their guns. The coal companies also exploited racial and ethnic tensions to keep workers from uniting. They'd bring in black miners from the south, Italian immigrants, Eastern Europeans, all speaking different languages, all looking at each other with suspicion instead of seeing their common enemy. The companies would deliberately pay different groups different wages, would give certain ethnicities the most dangerous jobs, all to foster resentment and prevent solidarity. It was a brilliant strategy of divide and conquer that kept the workforce fractured for decades. But something started to change in the years following World War I. Miners who had served overseas, who had fought for democracy and freedom, came home to find themselves living under a system that was anything but democratic or free. They'd seen different ways of life, had been exposed to ideas about workers' rights and collective bargaining, and they weren't willing to just go back to the way things were. The United Mine Workers of America, led by the charismatic John L. Lewis, began making serious inroads into West Virginia. Organizers would come into the camps at night, holding secret meetings in the woods, convincing miners that together they had power, that they didn't have to accept these conditions. And slowly, despite the danger, despite the threats and the violence, miners started signing union cards. The tipping point came in the spring of 1920 inches, a small town called Matewan. The name would soon become synonymous with the bloody conflict that was consuming southern West Virginia. When miners in the area joined the union, the Stone Mountain Coal Company did exactly what they'd always done. They fired them all and sent the Baldwin Felts detectives to evict them from company housing. But Matewan was different. The town's police chief was a man named Sid Hatfield, and unlike many law enforcement officials who were in the pocket of the coal companies, Hatfield sided with the miners. He was a local man. He'd grown up in these mountains, and he was sick of watching outside interests exploit his community. On the 19th of May, 1920, a group of 13 Baldwin Felts agents arrived in Matewan to carry out evictions. They went door to door, literally throwing families and their belongings into the muddy streets. They showed no mercy. Women, children, elderly folks, it didn't matter. Out they went. Word spread quickly through the town about what was happening, and by the afternoon, tensions were at a breaking point. Sid Hatfield confronted the detectives and attempted to arrest them. Producing a warrant, the detectives laughed it off, claimed the warrant was fake, and the situation escalated rapidly. What happened next is still debated to this day. Different witnesses gave different accounts, but what's certain is that within seconds, guns were drawn and bullets were flying. The gunfight lasted only a few minutes, but when it was over, the street was littered with bodies. 7 Baldwin Felts agents lay dead. including the two brothers who ran the agency's operations in the region. 2 miners were killed, and Mayor Cabell Testaman, who had stood with the miners, was mortally wounded. Sid Hatfield stood in the middle of the carnage, pistol still in hand, and became an instant folk hero. News of the Matewan massacre spread like wildfire through the coalfields. Here, finally, was a victory, however bloody, against the companies and their hired thugs. Sid Hatfield became a legend, a symbol of resistance. Miners started calling him Two-Gun Sid and told exaggerated stories of his prowess with a pistol. But the coal operators weren't about to let this stand. They wanted revenge, and more than that, they wanted to send a message that resistance would not be tolerated. The months following Matewan were marked by what became known as the 3 Days Battle and countless smaller skirmishes. It was guerrilla warfare in the mountains of West Virginia, with armed miners and company guards engaging in firefights, conducting ambushes, and terrorizing each other. The state government, heavily influenced by coal money, declared martial law and sent in troops, but they couldn't stop the violence. Then came the 1st of August 1921, the day that would seal Sid Hatfield's fate and light the fuse that would lead to Blair Mountain. Hatfield had been indicted on various charges. Most people believed they were trumped up, and he was scheduled to appear at the McDowell County Courthouse. He made the trip with his friend Ed Chambers, both men accompanied by their wives. As they climbed the courthouse steps in broad daylight, unarmed and flanked by their spouses, Baldwin Felt's agents emerged and opened fire. They shot Hatfield and Chambers multiple times, killing them both on the courthouse steps while their wives screamed. It was an execution, plain and simple, carried out in front of witnesses, and the killers were never prosecuted. The murder of Sid Hatfield was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Miners throughout southern West Virginia were done trying to work within the system, done appealing to authorities who clearly served the coal companies, done being peaceful in the face of violence. Within days of Hatfield's assassination, miners started gathering. They came from different counties, different camps, bringing whatever weapons they had: hunting rifles, old military rifles from the war, shotguns, pistols. They wore red bandanas around their necks to identify themselves as pro-Union, and they called themselves the Redneck Army. The term redneck, which would later become a slur, was born from this moment of working-class solidarity and rebellion. The miners' goal was to march south to Mingo and Logan counties, to free Union organizers who had been imprisoned, to break the stranglehold the coal companies had on the non-unionized territories. Union leadership tried to stop them. They knew that an armed insurrection would be a disaster for the labor movement, but the rank-and-file miners were beyond listening to pleas for restraint. By late August, an estimated 10,000 armed miners were on the march. Standing in their way was Logan County Sheriff Don Chaffin, a man who was essentially on the coal company's payroll. Chaffin had been preparing for this confrontation, and he assembled a defensive force of about 3,000 men, deputy sheriffs, state police, company guards, and local volunteers. He established a defensive line along Blair Mountain, a strategic position with elevated terrain. His men dug trenches, set up machine gun nests, and prepared for battle. This wasn't some ragtag group of amateurs. Many on both sides were World War I veterans who knew how to fight. On August 28, the two armies met. What followed was unlike anything America had seen since the Civil War. For 5 days, the mountains of West Virginia echoed with the sound of thousands of rifles, machine guns rattling away, explosions from dynamite bombs. Miners attempted to flank Chaffin's positions, to storm the trenches, to break through the defensive lines. Chaffin's forces held their ground, using the elevated position to rain fire down on the advancing miners. It was modern warfare, conducted on American soil by American citizens. Casualty estimates vary wildly. The coal companies had every reason to minimize the numbers, and accurate records weren't kept, but it's believed that somewhere between 50 and 100 men died, with hundreds more wounded. As the battle raged, President Warren G. Harding, under pressure from the coal operators and horrified at the prospect of a full-scale civil war, made the decision to intervene. He ordered federal troops to the area and threatened to use bombers to break up the conflict. Army Air Service planes actually dropped bombs, surplus explosives, and gas from World War I on the miners' positions, marking one of the first times the US military bombed its own citizens. Faced with the prospect of fighting the United States Army, the miners finally began to disperse. By September 4, the Battle of Blair Mountain was over. The immediate aftermath was devastating for the labor movement. Hundreds of miners were arrested and charged with various crimes, including treason and murder. Though most were eventually acquitted or given light sentences, the Union presence in southern West Virginia was crushed. The coal companies used the violence as proof that unions were dangerous radicals, and they tightened their control even further. Membership in the United Mine Workers in West Virginia plummeted. For years, the Battle of Blair Mountain was buried, a story that powerful interests wanted forgotten. But its legacy endured. The coal miners of West Virginia, though they lost that particular battle, had shown that American workers would fight literally for their rights. Their sacrifice, their willingness to take up arms against impossible odds, became part of the larger story of the American labor movement. The battles fought on Blair Mountain, in the streets of Matewan, in countless coal camps across Appalachia, eventually led to the labor reforms of the New Deal, to the establishment of collective bargaining rights, to the safety regulations and worker protections we take for granted today. The war in the West Virginia coalfields was about more than just wages or working conditions. It was about dignity, about whether workers would be treated as human beings or as expendable resources to be used up and discarded. Those miners in their red bandanas, marching toward Blair Mountain, knowing they might not come back, were fighting for a vision of America where working people had a voice, where you couldn't be evicted from your home for trying to organize, where your life had value beyond what you could produce for someone else's profit. Today, Blair Mountain still stands, though logging and mountaintop removal mining have scarred its slopes. There's no grand monument there, no national park, no tourist center telling the story of what happened. For most Americans, the Battle of Blair Mountain remains unknown, buried under decades of historical amnesia. But for those who know the story, who understand what those miners fought for, Blair Mountain is sacred ground, a place where ordinary people stood up to power, where they said enough, where they proved that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory seems impossible.